I would now like to introduce Congresswoman Nanette Barragan. Congresswoman Barragan was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in November 2016, becoming the first ever Latina to represent California's 44th Congressional District. She was selected by her peers to serve as both the freshman class president and regional whip for the 115th Congress, and has advocated for a bipartisan approach to resolving the standoff over DACA. Welcome, Congresswoman Barragan. Bob, back over to you.
Hey, thanks for joining us.
Good to see you.
Well, thanks, Congresswoman. So we're having this event on bipartisanship, and I was looking up to see how the last presidential race in your district, and I saw President Trump is very popular. He got a whopping 12% of the vote.
Right.
Hillary Clinton got 83% of the vote.
Correct.
So why are you here? What bipartisan? In some ways, because there are some swing state who are in tough. They're bipartisan, but usually people and lawmakers who represent districts that are so Democratic or so Republican, they're not interested in bipartisanship.
Well, people, when you talk to them at the local level, they care about getting jobs, they care about health care, they care about things that the rest of the country cares about. And the way you get there is through bipartisanship, especially when you're in the minority. You have to work with the majority to be able to get things done. So, look, my first day on the job, I asked, when do we get to do things with the Republicans? And they looked at me like I was crazy. And they said, oh, you have to wait to go to Harvard to do that. And we had to go outside on our own to try to build the relationships and establish those relationships to have the bipartisanship.
How did you do that?
Well, one of the things I do as a co-president of the freshman class is we do social events.
Okay.
You often read about books, how back in the day, members would stay behind, they would spend time with each other, through that build relationships. So what we've tried to do is to have a March Madness watch party, or some kind of social gathering where we get to see each other and get to know each other outside of being on the Hill. And sometimes that will lead to conversations about what can we work on together. And we actually had a day when we were at Harvard where there was staff in the room and their members were in the room. And we said, let's clear all the staff out. Because frankly, leadership sends people to take notes and see what's going on. And we cleared the room of all staff. And so you just had members of Congress in a room. And then we said, okay, let's put all the members who have been in the state legislatures in this side, and members who've never served before on this side. And we broke them up and we said, there's gotta be things we can work on. And what you saw in that room was something you don't see happening on the Hill. The hard part is, how do you keep that going when you don't have events that are bringing us together? When frankly, you know, within leadership, the Democrats and Republicans don't have these joint events where we're having these conversations. So it is more challenging, and you have to make an effort to go build these relationships. And it all starts with the relationship, because you're way more likely to get something done if you're friends with somebody. Look, I'm a lawyer, and what I realized is I settled the case if I liked opposing counsel and we got along. So we could say, hey, today in court, we're gonna go against each other, but afterward, we're gonna grab a cocktail, right? The same is true on the Hill, and the same is true here in Washington.
Now, I've talked to some members who say that in the hallway, there will not even be an exchange of hellos between a Republican and Democrat. Now, I'm not saying that's the norm, but there are members who say that and say it in a way that, you know, that's not really helpful at all. What do you see that the public doesn't see? Because the public sees fighting on C-SPAN, they see the battles, they see the president fighting with Democrats and sometimes Republicans in Congress. What do you see at those behind-the-scenes events that the public does not see?
It's very different. Amongst the freshman class, we like each other. We give each other hugs, we see each other. We had a bipartisan New Year's Eve event when we first got here. And it's funny because you get to know somebody on a personal basis. You take a photo with them, but then somebody will say, well, do you know their politics? Can you post that, right?
Right.
And so it becomes more challenging, I think, when you've come together, you have an idea, and then you hear your colleagues say, well, we can't do that because, leadership won't let us, or,
Right.
And then that's where the frustration begins. And that's where, people want us to work together, they want us to get something done, but there's a higher level there, which it sometimes can be a challenge. But we actually like each other. We get along. I'll be honest with you, there are some members where you may have had an exchange in committee, and because of that exchange, maybe you're not as friendly behind the scenes. You don't, go give them a hug and stuff.
Right.
But we actually do like each other, and there are avenues to do more bipartisanship, which other CODELs are great.
Right.
You get to travel on a bipartisan basis. I went to go visit our troops in Afghanistan. It was led by Republicans. I was one of 2 Democrats on the trip. I was one of 2 women on the trip. And through that, you get to know your colleagues. Now, some of them you may not agree on the policy.
Sure.
But we walked out of a meeting, I remember, with the State Department, and we said, why don't we lead a bipartisan letter on this issue, right? And so there are avenues to create those relationships. Not enough, though.
Right, but you've mentioned leadership. Is leadership one of the biggest obstacles? Because by definition, leadership is a partisan role.
I think it is, because if you had leadership on both sides, having these joint events together and doing more things together, I think that you might see a little different result. Now, it's gotten more partisan over the years. I think that's, on both sides of the aisle. And so, look, I'll be honest with you. I go to my district, which, as you mentioned, is super blue, and people say, fight everything, right? There are some people who want you to fight everything.
Right.
And I said, what good is that going to do if we want to, invest in infrastructure? What is that going to do if we want to invest in creating jobs? And so when you actually talk to people in a group, when we do a number of town halls, we find that people want something to get done. Now, sometimes our values don't match up on where that is, but DACA is a great example. It's a bipartisan issue that's hugely impacts my district. It's a majority-minority district, and it's about 70% Latino. And here we talk about it on a bipartisan basis, but we're not seeing any action. And that is frustration. Now, behind closed doors, some of my colleagues tell me, I want to do this. This is a priority for me. I'm with you. And then I say, well, why don't you sign the discharge petition to force a vote on this? Right? And then that is where, of course, well, I have to be more careful, right? And that becomes the leadership, and they help decide who goes on what committees, and the reality is, there's ongoing politics, on the Hill.
You remember the Congressional Hispanic Caucus. There was a controversy where Congressman Curbelo wanted in the caucus, and he was denied entry. In it, critics said that wasn't bipartisan, that he should have been allowed in. What do you say about that?
Every member has to decide on whether to vote to allow somebody in or out of a caucus. I'll be honest with you, at the caucus meetings, a lot of the conversation is talking about strategy and how we're going to get a bill passed. And my understanding from the CBC, they have to often excuse one of their Republican members.
Mia Love, right.
So that they could talk about that strategy. And with what's happening right now in the country, and the president being as divisive as he is, and frankly attacking immigrants and people of color quite a bit, that is 99% of our conversation. And so, different people have different concerns, and frankly, I think that you apply and the membership decides. I will tell you, he never reached out to me and asked me to support him, which I would have thought would have been the start of a bipartisan conversation. But, I disagree that it was not allowing him in didn't create a bipartisanship, or that should have been done.
We'll open it up to questions in 2 minutes, but I do want to ask you, you've worked with Congressman Mike Turner, a Republican, funding for urban parks. How did that relationship start?
Well, that one is, we were looking for anybody who cared about trying urban parks and funding for parks. You know, you talk to people, and this should not be partisan at all.
Right.
Everybody wants more parks, more green space. And it was just a matter of finding somebody who was willing to put their name on a bill. When you're a freshman member, that's harder to do. Now, I just did pass my first bill out of the House, which was coming through Homeland Security. Now, that's a very bipartisan committee, very different than Natural Resources, which is very partisan. In Homeland, we do have, the relationships are, I would say, better. We spend more time, I think, outside of committee with some of the members, at least I do. And so there was a really good opportunity in protecting critical infrastructure and mass transportation. And so we had one Republican didn't support the bill when it went through the House. Otherwise, it was overwhelmingly bipartisan, and we're hoping the Senate's going to take it up. It depends on where you are, the conversation. I during the Harvard training that we did, I had a Republican come up to me and say, "I want to work with you on campaign finance reform." And I looked at him and I was like, "Huh? I'm all for it. When do we get started?" And then the conversation was, "Oh, let's wait until after the primary," right?
Right.
So it depends on where you are. Sometimes they happen off the Hill in social settings. Sometimes you'll have a member, a Republican will come up to you on the House floor and say, "I have an idea, I want to work with you on this." So sometimes it's through the working groups. So if you're part of a working group and they know that you are, they'll come approach you. But a lot of it's through relationships and word of mouth, like, "Hey, so-and-so's working on this bill."
Sure.
And so we, and the one thing that is, I think, even more frustrating is you could have a bipartisan bill and you may not get a vote on it, right? And that has been very frustrating because here you are building these relationships, getting a bill together, getting the sponsors together, and then they still won't give you a vote.
Right.
And that's true of a number of these, DACA bills where they're bipartisan and we just can't get a vote on it, so.
A few minutes left. We will open it up for questions. If you have a question on bipartisanship and anything else going on in Congress, please raise your hand. In the back? I'll wait for the mic and then just identify yourself.
Congresswoman, thank you so much for being here. I'm Jesper Vandenberg. I'm an ISEC student at George Mason University. So I have a question a little bit on the flip side of bipartisanship, because a lot of the hyperpartisan districts tend to view bipartisanship, as you said, as sort of a negative thing. So how do you go back to your district and sort of explain to them, like, look, this is the value of working together. They gave us this, so we can get that. How do you sell your message to the constituents that might be a little upset that you're working with Republicans?
Well, the reality is that the people who come to our town halls, one of the things they ask is, "What are you doing for us? What are you getting done?" Right? They're not saying, "What did you fight this week in Congress?" Right? And so for me, when somebody asks me, "What did you get done?" or "What are you working on to get something done?" I have to say, "Look, we're in the minority party. I need Republicans to get this done." Whether it's investing in infrastructure or whether it's a vocational training program that they want more funding on. And so explaining how the system works is the first thing that I do, is I say, look, I don't get to set what goes to a vote. I don't get to set the hearings that we have in my committee. So the way I have to do this, I have to go find Republicans who are willing to work with me on this. And then we come up with an idea and then we put it together. And once you start explaining the process to them, they understand that you have to work with the other side, and we should be doing that either way. Otherwise, what ends up happening is you tell them, look, we then get a tax bill where you didn't have a single Democrat support, and frankly, in my communities, in my district, that's not going to help us, right? And I just heard a little of your conversation with the senator who was talking about the balanced budget, and now they're going to balance it with Social Security and Medicare. Well, guess what? That's completely wrong in my district, right? You're going to give a tax cut to the top 1% and 2%, and then who's going to pay for it? My working and middle-class families in my district. So then they're like, what are you doing to stop this? What are you doing to fight this, right? So it depends on the topic, and you do see more of the bipartisan, rather the partisan conversations happening on the top line things that we're seeing in the headlines, right? The immigration fight. The healthcare fight, the tax fight. So But there are areas where there is bipartisanship, and explaining it to people in the district, and making sure you're standing for your principles and your values, but that you find people with common ground to work on something.
Last question about President Trump. What can he do? Republicans say the polarization really started in the Obama administration. Democrats are saying it's certainly Trump's fault. What could Trump do, or is it really that I'm sure there are some Democrats you talk to who are like they're not gonna work with him on anything because he's poisoned the well? Do you think he can repair relationships?
The first thing he has to do is stay off of Twitter. I mean, that is not the way to do diplomacy.
I wouldn't hold my breath on that.
That is not the way to run a country. I mean, you don't build relationships through social media and tweeting at people. And you don't build relationships by bullying somebody on social media. And I think that's the first problem is we have. The second problem, frankly, that we have is we have a president we can't trust. We can't take his word for anything. One day he says he's for having a vote on a clean dream bill. The next hour, he says he's taken aback. How do you work with somebody if you can't sit down and look at them in the face and take their word for it when they say you have a deal? That has been, I think, one of the biggest challenges that we haven't seen in just about any other presidency, is generally a president will sit down with you, or if you're going to work with them, they give you your word, they stand by that word, not taking it back a few hours later. So I don't know how you get there to have the trust built. And I think there are people who are willing to work with the president, willing to work on being bipartisan with him, but we need some goodwill showing of action, not just talking about working, but action, right? And the number one person who's been torpedoing the positive moving forward on DACA has been him. So it has been very frustrating to have somebody in a position like his who we feel that we can't trust.
We've run out of time. Please thank the Congresswoman. Thanks for coming.
Thank you for having me.
Appreciate it.
I appreciate it. Thank you.